is an event to celebrate two wonderful translators and to celebrate Marian Schwartz's latest published translation, The Last and the First. So that is super exciting. We're so excited to have her here. It's a huge deal, so no big deal, but it's a big deal. So I wanted to mention also to folks here in the store and also watching for this event, we are having a little sale to celebrate our translators of 25% off translated works. So please do shop around if you're here in the store. If you give us a call at the store, we're happy to help you out, folks who are watching virtually. You can give us a call, leave us a message, mention this event, and you'll get 25% off translated works. Pretty exciting. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our authors. And I'm super excited to do that. And my name is Kelsey. I don't know if I mentioned that. But I'm Kelsey, and I work here at Malvern. I'm happy to be here. All right. So we're going to start off with Marian Schwartz in the flesh. So exciting. Marian Schwartz translates Russian classic and contemporary fiction and nonfiction. She is the recipient of numerous honors, including 2 NEA translation fellowships. Her latest published translation is Nina Berberova's not very good at this, sorry. First novel, The Last and the First. Currently, she is working on untranslated works by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Please welcome to the stage, Marian Schwartz. Thank you so much.
I'll pronounce all Russian names.
We're getting messages that the audio needs adjusting, that there's a lot of echo going on.
All right.
Let's see. Let's make sure that that is the only microphone on. Should be. Maybe it's just the distance from. Oh, I see.
Joe's got it.
My guess is that.
Do I-
Anybody, what?
No, I don't know. I was gonna say mute. Well, I was gonna ask it, but if we mute it, then we won't be able to hear them, right?
Yeah.
So you just do like a mid shot. You could have like a chest up, you know.
Oh,
you
the
move in.
picture's fine. It's the,
But I think if you move closer. You know.
that's what I was thinking. If we move closer, that might take care of it.
Okay.
It's echoing.
Yeah.
Look at it. We're back. Are we back?
I'd say talk a little bit and let's see if they say that it's echoing again.
We're fixing the sound here. I hope everyone's staying with us. Are we back?
Yes.
Great.
Move it closer if you can.
Okay, Marian, here we come.
Okay, they're closing in on me. Okay.
Okay, now you can-
Does it?
You can have the legs at the bottom can if you need more height.
No, he wants me to tilt it back this way and I can't tilt it any farther back. Oh, you think I need to drop this? Lower this plate.
There you are, Mary.
Oh, good.
There you are. It's not just your beads talking. It's your beautiful self. There you are.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. It's so exciting doing a new kind of event. It's the first at Malvern since everything shut down, so we're thrilled this is working as well as it's working. I want to thank Malvern so much for opening this up to us. It really makes a difference to do an event in person with even just some audience. So we're very grateful that Malvern's letting us do that and inaugurate this effort. I also want to mention again that this is a celebration of International Translation Day, which was actually Thursday on the 30th. And for many years now, we've celebrated it here. Usually it's a huge crowd, huge book buying crowd, and we really celebrate translation. So let's try to bring that celebratory mood to this event as well in our small, yay, we're jazz hands. I'm going to be talking about this latest translation I've published, The Last and the First by Nina Berberova, published by Pushkin Press. Nina Berberova was born in St. Petersburg in 1901, and she died in Philadelphia in 1993. At that point, already eventually a US citizen. She had lived through the Russian Revolution as a teenager. She emigrated she was in high school actually during the revolution. In 1922, she emigrated with the great Russian poet Vladislav Kavasevich and lived for 25 years in Paris, where she earned her living. She was self-supporting as a writer. She wrote primarily for the Russian language periodicals published in Paris. In 1950, having lived through the war and the occupation, she emigrated to the United States, really with virtually nothing. She had no English. She had no college degree because her education had been cut short. She had no money. She had basically no name. She did have some contacts here and people who did help her, so she wasn't completely adrift. But she came with virtually nothing, and when she died, at that point she had taught at both Yale and Princeton for many years without a college degree, and had gained tremendous fame around the world, particularly in France, where she was a huge celebrity. The irony not being lost on her that they had completely ignored her while she lived there for 25 years. She was so well known that I remember when I moved back to Austin, we would talk, and she had been to Paris, and she was so excited. She said, Le Monde ran an interview with me and Rostropovich, the great cellist, and she said, and they said my name and they didn't identify me. Then I knew I had made it. She was so famous that they didn't have to give a tagline, the Russian writer or anything. It was just Nina Berberova or Nina Berberova in France. The Last and the First was the first novel she published. As I said, she'd already published a great many other stories and other kinds of articles and periodicals. And unlike all her other fiction, because I've read all her fiction, so I can say this is the only one that's overtly political. It feels like it's her first novel, it feels like what she had to get off her chest before she could move on to other writing with less explicitly topical material. The phenomenon she's talking about is something called возвращенство, which means returnism. It was a period in the 20s in Europe when the Soviet Union was trying to bring back skilled and educated people because they were trying to rebuild their economy. And they not only bring back refugees, but also people who had kind of taken a low profile inside the Soviet Union because they would be considered counter-revolutionaries and they were in danger. But they were trying to bring people back. So that's one of the main threads in this is the younger son, Vasya, being lured back to the Soviet Union by his father, who's become a big shot in the new Soviet state. But the one thing that starts here, and it's actually virtually everything she wrote, is her concern with what happened to her generation. These people who maybe didn't get fully educated in Russia and certainly didn't have a professional footing yet when they left, and were forced into exile and were just set adrift. And what was their fate? And most of her fiction concerns one person or another who was left unprepared for this kind of exile, especially exile that as far as they knew, the Bolsheviks could be wiped out and could be pushed out, at least in the 20s. The action in the stories opens in Provence, in the south of France, where Vasya's older brother, Ilya, has brought his family, his stepmother, Vasya, and his sister, Mariana, to farm. Ilya has a notion that this is a way to create a future for the exiles. And he's doing it for himself and his family, but also has larger ideas of how this might be applicable to other impoverished Russian refugees. So I'm going to read from the beginning, as I often like to do, and I'll just read the first paragraph in Russian. 20 сентября 1928 года утром между 9 и 10 часами случились 3 события, положивших начало этой повести. Алексей Иванович Шайбин, один из многочисленных героев ее, появился у Горбатовых. Вася, Горбатовский сын, детище Степана Васильевича и Веры Кирилловны, и сводный брат Ильи Степановича, получил письмо из Парижа от приятеля своего Адольфа Келлмана с важными известиями об отце. И, наконец, на ферму Горбатовых, в широкую долину департамента Вaucluse, пришел нищий странник с поводыркой. On the morning of the 20th of September, 1928, between 9 and 10, 3 events occurred that set the stage for this tale. Alexei Ivanovich Shaibin, one of its many heroes, turned up at the Gorbatovs. Vasya, the Gorbatov's son, offspring of Stepan Vasilyevich and Vera Kirillovna, and stepbrother of Ilya Stepanovich, received a letter from Paris from his friend Adolf Kellerman with important news about Vasya's father. And finally, a poor wayfarer and his guide arrived at the Gorbatov's farm in a broad valley of the Vaucluse. No one knew this man's name. Who was he? What road had led him to his present wanderings? He had passed through here the previous year in the spring, and he was already known in the surrounding area. At that time, he was still sighted and walked alone, an old Astrakhan cap pulled to his eyes, sending up white dust and bowing to those he met. He had spoken with Ilya and with Vera Kirillovna herself for a long time. He drunk, had dinner, and spent the night. But neither Vasya nor his sister Mariana saw the wayfarer the next morning. He had left at dawn, blessing the house, the orchard, and the cowshed where the oxen slept, and the attic where Ilya slept. Later, people said he'd gone west, but more likely he'd gone southwest, past Toulouse, to see the Cossacks who had settled in those parts. Now he was blind, and that same Astrakhan cap had slipped over his shaggy eyebrows. A dark blue scar ran across his face, and he had no beard growing on his cheeks. You could tell a regimental doctor had once mended his face in haste, slapping together the torn pieces of his no longer young, swarthy skin. He was tall and ominously thin, and his military trousers sported red patches in many places, possibly scraps from someone else's service trousers, but French, trousers that had once known the defense of Verdun. The wayfarer walked with his harsh, withered hand resting on the shoulder of his guide, a black-eyed girl of about 12, whose name was Anita. They stopped at the gate, and the old man took off his cap. The girl looked over the low stone wall. There she saw an orchard, a vegetable plot, and a house with outbuildings partially hidden by stocky willows. In the silence and cool of the morning, the house stood low, burned by the sun over the long summer, with a north-facing porch and squat asparagus shoots. while farther away, past the dark blue shadow of moribund cypresses, plowed fields spread out, ready for winter crops. This was a human habitation created not in struggle with nature, but at one with it. The sun was already high in the untroubled sky, and birds flew swiftly in its gleam, like short, darting needles sewing through it. Vasya and Mariana went over to the gate, even though they were up to their ears in work. They pushed back their round straw hats, which were as hard as tin, and their hands were covered in dirt. You could have sung something, Mariana said. Where have you come from? She began examining Anyuta, her long, colorful skirt and the narrow ribbon tied around her head. The wayfarer made a low, unhurried bow. From the Dordogne, gentle lady, he said. We are on our way south, from the Dordogne to the Sianya River, to hot climes, to see good people, and in the spring back to our own people for the summer. And there, God will provide. People know us. Vasya came closer, his face bathed in sweat. But what are you going there for? He asked. Anyuta gave him a frightened look. Her heart started pounding for fear they would have to leave without seeing the person they'd come to see, for the sake of whom they'd made a detour from the highway, past the river and mill. How can these people ask? How dare they? She thought. We walk, my dear boy, the wayfarer replied, because we're too old and blind to work. We go to good people's homes to eat and have conversations with good people, and we do not complain of our Lord God. Mariana shrugged lightly and grinned. Why do you speak so oddly? We were told you were an educated man, or else a priest. Anyuta rushed to the old man in despair. Granddad, can we go? Granddad, she whispered, tugging on his sleeve. Let's go, dear Granddad. We can come some other time. The beggar put his hand on her shoulder, but did not go where she was pulling him. He took 2 steps toward the wall, making a deep rut in the road dust with his staff. They told you wrong, my good lady, he replied, and his micacious eyes flashed. I am no priest, nor was I a doctor or an engineer. Allow us to sit on your little porch. I know in your part of the world, porches always look into the shade, and if Vera Kirilovna can find a little water for us, Anyuta and I would be very grateful. And he bowed abruptly at the waist. Mariana opened the gate, and the wayfarer passed between her and Vasya, Anyuta leading him. He walked majestically, without that grim fussiness so often characteristic of the blind. They passed slowly between the vegetable beds toward the house. From time to time, the beggar lifted his right hand from Anyuta's thin shoulder and made a fluid cross over the beds and the house and the bent pear trees' smeared trunks. A sack hung motionlessly from his shoulder. The sack was military, like his trousers. No one knew this man's name. Mariana watched him go, grinned again, and leaned over the shoots poking out of the earth. Come on, let's go. Let's listen, Vasya said. Or does nothing have anything to do with you anymore? He wiped his wet face with his sleeve and looked at her expectantly. No, it doesn't, Mariana replied reluctantly. There's nothing for me to hear, but you go on. Something stirred in Vasya's sleepy face. His gaze slid down Mariana's back, her black gathered skirt, her wooden shoes. I've just had a letter from Adolf, he said so sullenly. Has that nothing to do with you? Mariana turned her merry, high-cheekboned face toward him. Maybe he's summoning you? Yes, he writes about Father. Old Kellerman has come and wants a meeting with me. Father's been found, and he has an important post. Mariana clapped her hands and gave her brother a frightened look. Oh, that Garbakov, she exclaimed. He lets us know through Kellerman. He wants to lure you there. Vasya sat down beside her and put an arm around his knees. It's time for me to go, he said firmly. Father is calling, demanding that at least one of us return. At first, old Kellerman was going to demand Adolf get Ilya, but Adolf told him flat out that was impossible. Whereas I've been wanting to go there for a whole year, and Adolf has summoned me. He writes that my papers can be in order in 2 days. A whole year, Mariana said slowly. I never tried to pretend otherwise. Mama knows it. And so does Ilya. I just can't here. My path takes me home to father. And this is the goal Kellerman and I share. He dropped his head. I know that Kellerman is trying to get in father's good graces, but does that matter, Mariana? I might have gone even without this. No, you wouldn't. I don't know. It's impossible for me here. Father's working with Kellerman there and despises our settling here. I'm going. I'll have money. I'll have the life I want. I didn't choose this one. And you know, it's essential to me. I mean, roots are absolutely essential. Ilya says we should have roots in the air. Ilya's always going to say something you don't know how to answer. But there, father's a big shot. He sent Kellerman to Paris on business and he's going back in a month. You have to understand, I've been waiting a whole year for this, waiting for Berbatov to turn up and summon me. Adolf has worn me down. He's the one who won you over, and he's the one sending you after your roots. He's a scoundrel, your Adolf, and Berbatov's a fine one, to lure you away, to tempt you. Oh, Vasya, dear Vasya, what an automaton you are, my God. If I were Ilya, I would lock you in the attic and go to Paris myself and demand that Kellerman back off. If they don't leave you in peace, someone should lodge a complaint. There's manure to shovel here and you're leaving. Vasya was quiet for a moment. It's true, Vasya. Let Ilya go to Paris. Wait for him. This is all about your weak will. You're flattered that a passport will be ready in 2 days. Don't laugh. There's a direct train to Niagara. I know. Old Kellerman is clearly trying to curry favor with Berbatov. He's promising to return his Sonny Boy, promising Sonny Boy his roots. It would be better if Berbatov went missing altogether. There'd be more left of him. Did Mama really not talk to you? What can Mama say? Anything she's going to say will be less than what she's doing. If, she says, if you don't see what our whole life's been for, I can't help you. If you haven't understood why we're living like this, so be it. Come back when you have. But Berbatov, she says, him, I curse. Vasya stood up and wrung his hands in anguish. Go, Mariana said, bending over. She's right. You didn't start this, those scoundrels did, and that includes Berbatov. Go. Vasya waited, but Mariana didn't straighten up, and he slowly walked away. Dirt stuck to his wooden shoes. He clasped his hands behind his back. He hesitated as to where to go and started uncertainly toward the house. The kitchen door was wide open. Anyuta was sitting in the doorway, and her slender little fingers were sorting through a bunch of dark, dusty grapes. The wayfarer's low, placid voice reached her from the kitchen. Through her spread fingers, Mariana clearly saw which way Vasya had gone. As soon as he disappeared into the kitchen, she jumped up, let down her tucked skirt, wiped her hands on her hem, straightened the hat on her short, thick hair, and ran out of the gate. There wasn't a soul on the road at that already hot morning hour. The untouched track made by the postman who buzzed by here on his bicycle an hour before lay calmly in the dust. The black fields and the bands of meadows that had been mowed for a third time were empty and scentless, as they are in the autumn. Mariana ran tentatively at first and then faster and faster. When she finally reached the main boundary path, her heavy strapped wooden shoes pounding. Main boundary road, she shot off like an arrow down the dismal old boundary path, her heavy strapped wooden shoes pounding. She flew past the stubble field and skirted the old farm. A dog yelped and wet linens rustled in the wind. She ran as far as the grove and stopped. Something cracked in the branches.
Thank you. Kelsey, you're going to introduce Philip now?
All right.
Thank you so much, Miriam. That was wonderful. It's long live indie bookstores, long live readings. I just love it. That just really fueled my soul. So I'm super excited to welcome our next reader, Philip Boehm. And after Philip's reading, we will have the honor of seeing Philip and Marian in conversation. So stick around for that as well. So Philip Boehm has translated more than 30 books and plays by German and Polish writers, including Herta Müller, Franz Kafka, and Hanna Krall. For these translations, he has received numerous awards, including NEA and Guggenheim fellowships, and most recently the Helen and Wolff Translators Prize. He also works as a theater director and playwright. Works for the stage include Alma and Venta, Mixtitlan, and Return of the Bedbug. Mr. Boehm is the founding artistic director of the Upstream Theater in St. Louis, recipient of the 2021 Missouri Arts Award. Please welcome Philip.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank Malvern Books. It's the second time I've had the opportunity to read here, and it's a great pleasure. And it's a great pleasure to see people in a bookstore for a live event, not only live, but augmented live, let's say. So I'm going to be reading from the
Give us-
passenger.
1 second, it's cutting off your head.
We can't take it back. If we take it back, it'll echo.
Okay, well, it's cutting off his head.
I know. We could fix. Squat down.
Squat down.
No, it's fine. It's fine. You just have to adjust this. Ooh, I broke it.
Is this new?
Just a second. Yeah. A lot better, probably. Teddy, lefty, loosey. There you go.
Okay,
Kind of.
great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
More adjustments. Anyway, it's also a pleasure to be meeting with Marian for the second time. And it's also a pleasure to be invited to Austin. So I'm going to read from Ulrich Alexander Boschwitz's novel, The Passenger, which came out a few months ago, published by Metropolitan Books in the United States and by the same Pushkin Press in the UK. I'll tell you a little more about the book after the reading. I'm going to read a tiny bit from the German, just to give you a hint, and then I'll read a selection from the translation. Jetzt erst kam der Kellner, nachdem vorhin vergeblich Ausschau gehalten hatte. Soll man hier eigentlich auf die Kellner oder auf die Züge warten? Erkundigte sich Silbermann scharf, der einen Abscheu gegen alles hatte, was nach Schlamperei aussah und dessen Stimmung wenig freundlich war. Entschuldigen Sie, antwortete der Kellner. In der 2. Klasse glaubte ein Herr, einem Juden gegenüber zu sitzen und beschwerte sich deshalb. Es war aber gar kein Jude, es war ein Südamerikaner. Und weil ich etwas Spanisch kann, hat man mich gerufen. Es ist schon gut. Silbermann erhob sich, sein Mund verengte sich zu einem Strich und den Kellner traf ein strenger Blick aus seinen grauen Augen. Der wiegelte ab. Es war wirklich kein Jude, versicherte er. Anscheinend hielt er seinen Gast für einen ganz besonders strammen Parteimann. Nee, es interessiert mich nicht. Ist der Zug nach Hamburg schon abgefahren? Enough of German. And I'm going to read, beginning with that same passage from the translation. The main character, Silbermann, is a well-to-do Jewish merchant in Berlin. And this is in November of 1938, the very day that the Kristallnacht pogroms are happening. Silbermann, like many Jewish merchants, were trying to, at one point, hold on to what they could salvage of their business, debating should they leave Germany. And as things got worse and worse, many of them did leave, but there was also this identity. He's also a German. He's a Jewish German, but he's a German. But the Nazi Party, of course, deprived Jewish citizens of their Jewish Germans of their citizenship at one point, and made it increasingly difficult for them to do business. So that's the setting. Silbermann is here at a train station. He has just seen his business partner, who had been a manager in his firm, but had been elevated to the status of partner because he could, as a Jew, no longer own the majority percentage of his firm. So he's just seeing this guy Becker off, and he's at the restaurant in the train station. The waiter Silbermann had been looking for earlier, without success, finally appeared. "Are guests meant to wait for service here or for the trains?" asked Silbermann, his sharp tone expressing his disdain for anything that approached slovenliness or exuded an unfriendly air. "I beg your pardon," answered the waiter. "A gentleman in second class was complaining because he thought he was sitting across from a Jew, but it wasn't a Jew at all. The man was from South America, and since I know a little Spanish, I was called in to help." "I see." Silbermann got up. His mouth contracted into a line, and his gray eyes fixed the waiter with a severe look. The waiter tried to smooth things over. "It really wasn't a Jew," he assured Silbermann. Evidently, the waiter considered his guest to be a particularly staunch member of the party. "I'm not interested in that. Has the train for Hamburg already left?" The waiter glanced at the clock above the exit to the platforms. 7:20, he thought out loud. "The train for Magdeburg is just leaving. Hamburg leaves at 7:24. If you hurry, you can still make it. I wish that someday I could go running to catch a train, but people like me." He brushed a few breadcrumbs off the table with a napkin. "The best would be," the waiter went on, picking up the previous subject, "if the Jews had to wear yellow bands on their arms, then at least there wouldn't be any confusion." Silbermann looked at him. "Are they really so terrible?" he asked quietly, regretting his words even as he spoke them. The waiter looked at Silbermann as though he hadn't understood him right. He was clearly surprised, but also unsuspecting, since Silbermann had none of the features that marked him as a Jew according to the tenets of the racial scientists. "The whole thing has nothing to do with me," the man said at last carefully. "Still, it would be good for the others. My brother-in-law, for example, looks a little Jewish, but of course he's an Aryan. It's only that he has to constantly explain and prove everything over and over. That's too much to ask of anyone." "Yes, it is," Silbermann agreed. Then he paid his tab and left. Unbelievable, he thought. Absolutely unbelievable. After leaving the train station, he climbed into a taxi and headed home. The streets were full of people, many in uniform. Newsboys were hawking their papers, and Silbermann had the impression they were doing a brisk business. For a moment, he considered buying one for himself, but then decided against it. Since he figured the news was bound to be bad and almost certainly hostile, at least as far as he was concerned, he would undoubtedly be experiencing it all firsthand soon enough. After a short ride, the taxi pulled up in front of his building. Frau Friedrichs, the wife of the concierge, was lingering in the stairwell. She greeted him politely, and Silbermann was somehow glad to see that her behavior remained unchanged. As he stepped onto the red plush runner and climbed the stairs, he once again had this sensation that his life was only half real. Recently, such ruminations have become a habit. I'm living as though I weren't a Jew, he thought, somewhat incredulous. For the time being, I'm simply a well-to-do citizen, under threat, it's true, but as of yet unscathed. How is this possible? I live in a modern 6-room apartment. People talk to me and treat me as though I were one of them. They act as if I'm the same person I used to be, the liars. It's enough to give a man a guilty conscience. Whereas I'd like to show them a clearer picture of reality, namely that as of yesterday, I am something different because I am a Jew. And who did I used to be? No, who am I? What am I really? A swear word on 2 legs, one that people mistake for something else. I no longer have any rights, and it's only out of propriety or habit that so many act as though I do. My entire existence is based solely on the faulty memory of people who essentially wish to destroy it. They just happen to have forgotten about me. I've been officially degraded, but the public debasement has yet to take place. So then he goes back to his apartment, and while he's there, the stormtroopers come knocking at the door, and he has to make a quick exit on the back stairs. I'll read a paragraph that gives a sense of what he's feeling at that moment. Silbermann hurried down the back stairs. They're probably lying in wait for me, he thought. Ah, I should have stayed. What's going to happen to Elfriede now? He wondered whether he shouldn't go back. But Findler is there, he reassured himself. A good thing, that is, too. The man's a decent person despite everything. If I'd stayed upstairs, I'm sure I would have done something out of desperation, resisted or actually fired the gun. After all, you have to do something. You can't just let them do whatever they want to you. Not that that would have helped matters. On the contrary, Silbermann realized that if he had fired, it would have been out of fear. Fear, plain and simple. Fear of the concentration camp, fear of prison, and fear of being beaten. Dignity, he thought. A person has his dignity, and that's something you can't let anyone take away. So in the book, he's running and running and running. He's catching train after train. And this takes him back and forth all across Germany. And he's, as he boards one train, he has this feeling that he's just coming in permanent motion. He stood up, this is much like in the book. He stood up and headed to the platform, trudging rather than walking. More and more train rides, he thought, farther and farther away, and meanwhile, I'm already dog-tired. Back and forth and back. I'm so fed up with it already. He sat down on his suitcase and waited for the train. Who, or rather, what am I now anyway? He asked himself, am I still Silbermann, Otto Silbermann, the merchant? Undoubtedly, but how did he wind up in such a situation? He contemplates even suicide, then he winds up on a train and in another train, wants to talk to people. He misses the human interaction. He's in a compartment, a train compartment with a group of people. I want a conversation, Silbermann thought. I'd like to keep talking without stopping. He rested his head against his coat, which was hanging on the hook, and closed his eyes. He listened to the rattle of the wheels. Berlin, Hamburg, he thought. Hamburg, Berlin, Berlin, Aachen, Aachen, Dortmund, Dortmund, Aachen, and it may go on that way forever. Now I really am like a traveling salesman, and the route I've been assigned has more and more miles. The fact is that I have already immigrated to the Deutsche Reichsbahn. I am no longer in Germany. I am in trains that run through Germany. That's a big difference. Once again, he listened to the wheels rumbling over the rails, the music of travel. I am safe, he thought, I am in motion. And on top of that, I feel practically cozy. Wheels rattle, doors open. It could be almost pleasant if it weren't for the fact that I think too much. More trains, and then ultimately, this is the brushed version. And ultimately, he attempts to escape. So he takes a train that brings him close to the Belgian border. And this is the last section I'll read. And on that last train ride, he met, there was a young woman whose fiancé was a chauffeur for a wealthy person who was originally from Aachen, where he now wound up. But that chauffeur had been in a leftist party and had spent time in a concentration camp because the Nazis had, of course, persecuted the leftists. He'd gotten out of the concentration camp and he was working as a chauffeur. Silbermann met the fiancée who said, hey, maybe there's a connection, and Silbermann was able to pay this man to take him close to the Belgian border. And he took him there, and now Silbermann's on his own as he attempts to cross the border. A light rain began, this is the middle of the night, a light rain began to fall. The drops splashed against Silbermann's face. He hurried ahead as fast as the suitcase allowed. He still felt some of the security that being close to Franz, the chauffeur, had provided. It's going to work out, he hoped. If only I'd left this crazy suitcase at home. He thought about leaving it in the woods, but opening it and unpacking the money seemed too dangerous. I've lugged it this far, so I'll go on lugging it some more, he thought, when he had to set it down again. Otherwise, the whole slog would have been for nothing. He felt so exhausted that he had to rest for a moment. I wonder if Franz is going to get into trouble, he asked himself. I don't even know his last name. I'll never be able to thank him. But what a stroke of luck. Actually, I have that fat police spy on the train to thank for meeting him. Belgium, he then thought. I'm now in Belgium, and it doesn't look any different. I ought to be mad with joy, but instead, I'm afraid. And it's the same fear I had 5 minutes ago when I was still in Germany. If only, he thought he heard a noise and strained to listen. Weren't those twigs snapping somewhere? Jumped up, lifted his suitcase and looked around wide-eyed. No, he whispered. No, it's over. I quit. I'm staying right here. I'm staying here even if. But there was no noise. He'd been mistaken. The rain dripped down on him and calmed him somewhat. He picked up his suitcase and set off again. The blister on his index finger had burst from carrying the suitcase, and the pain refused to let up. He switched the suitcase to the other hand. What if I get caught now, he thought, and sent back to Germany? But that simply can't happen. To make as little noise as possible, he went exceedingly slowly, testing the ground with his feet to avoid any missteps. At least I'm in Belgium, he then thought. I managed after all. The forest began to clear, and through the darkness, he could make out something lighter colored. The road, he thought. He started to walk more quickly without paying attention to the noise made by the snapping twigs. When he was out of the woods, he looked around. He felt an almost celebratory sensation. My shadow existence is over, he thought. Now I'll become a human again. After he had carefully scanned the area and failed to see anything suspicious, he crossed the road. Before him was an open field. Keep going straight ahead, he remembered. He jumped over a small ditch and felt the soft, damp, tilled earth beneath his feet. If only I hadn't taken this damn suitcase with me, he again wished. All of a sudden, he heard sounds coming from the forest. Twigs crackled. First, one flashlight switched on within a second, and 2 figures emerged from the darkness about 20 meters from the place he had just passed and headed in his direction. At the first suspicious sound, Silbermann had instantly thrown himself down and was now dragging his suitcase behind him, which thudded on the ground. His heart was pounding, and he opened his mouth wide to breathe. He pushed his face as close to the ground as his increasingly urgent need for air allowed. Only the blurred outlines of the men were visible. They were standing in the middle of the road, pointing their flashlights this way and that. They conferred in whispers and seemed to disagree as to which direction he had taken, and then they separated. One stayed in place while the other walked over to the ditch, where he shined his light up and down before setting off in the opposite direction from Silverman. Meanwhile, the man who had stayed lit a cigarette and started walking very deliberately right toward Silverman. He seemed utterly sure of himself, almost as though he were mocking both his colleague, who had doggedly continued in the wrong direction and was now 50 paces away, as well as the man who thought he could remain hidden. This can't be, Silverman prayed that it not be true. This simply cannot be. He can't have seen me. No. At the same time, he knew that the man who was now only 10 paces away could surely hear his fitful breathing. Silverman pressed his hand against his mouth. Eh bien, a calm voice now said, voulez-vous rester là? The man shone the light in Silverman's face. Je l'ai trouvé, the guard now called out to his companion, who came hurrying over. Silverman had a hard time getting up. Je suis, he began. Vous avez traversé la frontière, the guard interrupted him, and once again shone the light in Silverman's face. Il faut retourner. Je suis un réfugié, Silverman continued, his voice hoarse. Je suis juif. Tiens, tiens, the guard replied, mais quand même, vous n'avez pas le droit de passer la frontière. Il faut venir avec un visa. Alors, venez. In the meantime, the other guard had arrived. You have to go back to Germany. But I'm a refugee. I'm Jewish. They wanted to arrest me. They locked me up in a concentration camp. We're not allowed to let you through. Come with us. The man grabbed him by the arm and started leading him back to the forest. The guard who had discovered him carried Silverman's suitcase and left it talking to his colleague. When they reached the road, Silverman stopped. I protest, he said. I'm staying here. You don't have the right. You're not allowed to do this. I'm in a free country. You crossed the border illegally. I had no choice. I was persecuted. But everybody can't just come to Belgium. I have papers. I have money. Wait, let me show you. Come on, the guard shoved him in. But Silverman resisted. You have to understand. He said, I can no longer go back. I only intended to stay one day in Belgium. My son lives in Paris. I want to go to Paris to join him. Explain that to the Belgian consul in Germany. We have orders, but I'm not going back. I demand to be taken to the guardhouse. It's not my fault. I had to cross the border illegally. I'm being persecuted. It's not Belgium's fault. We're sorry. They had crossed the road. Silverman stopped again. I can't go back, he said. It's impossible. He turned to the guard who was carrying his suitcase. Mais oui, mon ami. That's completely possible, the man calmly replied. So, thank you very much. So I guess we should.
Yeah. Go ahead and move this.
Should we adjust that?
That was, I read the book and I was still, my legs going. It's for those of you who haven't read it yet, this is a book that's so intense that when I started reading it, I had to do nothing else because it was completely upsetting my sleep, everything. I was thinking about it at night. I was thinking about it all the time. And it's a remarkable book because for me, having spent so much of my adolescent years and later thinking about concentration camps, something I thought a lot. And always in stories about concentration camps, all the prisoners are clever. You know, they have these schemes and they get out and they think of ways to make life better. And this guy does what I would do, which is he panics. And the way it conveys that feeling of panic and bad decisions and poor thinking is, I've never read anything like that before.
But what's remarkable, and I thought it might come out now, as opposed to earlier, the man who wrote this, he wrote it feverishly in the weeks after Kristallnacht. And he himself, his mother was an Aryan by the Nazi standards. His father was Jewish, but had died before he was even born. And he grew up not thinking of himself as Jewish. But he had a sister that when the Nuremberg laws were passed, the sister they were suddenly classified as at least Jewish and to some degree. The sister moved to Palestine. He and his mother escaped to Scandinavia. Ultimately, they wound up in England. It's a long story. Wound up in England, and when the war broke out, they were interned as enemy aliens.
Yeah.
And he was shipped off to Australia, to a prisoner of war camp, essentially, although he was a refugee. And in 1942, by that time, he was allowed back to England because they had determined these people are on our side. And he boarded a troop ship back to England, but the Germans torpedoed that ship in October of 1942. And so this novel, the fact that it happened, it had come out, and a version of it had come out in English, but a very abridged version, and he was working on rewriting it.
English, you said.
It had come out in English, an English version. It had never been published in German.
And wasn't it published in Swedish?
Another novel was published in Swedish. I don't know. I don't think this one was. I think this one was only published in English. But the other one was published in Sweden. And this novel, he was rewriting it, and he had sent his mother letters about possible rewrites, and had suggested that if some of the rewrites he was sending with another acquaintance didn't reach her, did she find someone of a literary bent who could then work with it? He wanted to rewrite it. Years passed, the novel goes forgotten. And the German publisher, the publisher of the German edition, was in Israel doing an interview for Haaretz, the newspaper. And the daughter of that sister who had emigrated to Palestine reads that this guy is here and says, "Oh, you know, I had an uncle who had a manuscript that you might be interested in." It turned out there was a German version of a manuscript in a library in Frankfurt. This German editor went there and he re-edited the whole book, and that's what has been published now in all over. So it's quite a remarkable story.
Quite. Yeah, it feels like a book that had the author had more time with it, would have changed, especially the second half, I think, would have changed. But the first half is absolutely.
That sense of urgency. And what's interesting about these two books, apart from the fact that they're both published by Pushkin Press, we're in this age of ideological rumbling and these movements that are precipitated by people taking power in the name of an ideology, and there's a shifting in society. The old orders are being uprooted, and Nina Berberova chronicles these exiles, and they actually escaped in some way, and they are in some way a weird reflection of where Silbermann could have wound up, right?
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we were talking earlier about this strange overlap, or kind of shall we say echo of the books. But I had a few questions for you. Okay, so first of all, I'm really the very first sentence you read that sets the tale. You know, on the morning of 20th September 1928, between 9 and 10, 3 events occurred that set the stage for this tale. It sounds like out of Gogol. I mean, it's like this self-referential. We're going to be telling a tale here, and we're going to keep talking about you. And that's Is that common of all of her writings? You translated so many of her books. It seems
No,
it's
I would
not.
say, it stands really in high contrast
Mhm.
that she would evoke this earlier format and earlier voice for telling a story. You know, then if someone in the 19th century had done that, then they would introduce every character, tell you all their qualities, everything they look like, and the story would start, you know, 20 pages later. But
And
she
have fun with
doesn't,
doing that.
and she gives you no quarter. I mean, she gives no quarter to anyone. She starts out with, you know, an alphabet soup of names, which is even, it's a little dense even for a Russian speaker. And she just proceeds to lay out all these threads that raise questions like, why is Mariana, why does it have nothing to do with her? Why, you know, all these questions, she ends up just raising questions that eventually gets told. But so I think that I love how it starts with that old voice.
Yeah, it's 19th century.
And then all of a sudden, wham.
And there's a kind of absurdity. There is a Gogolian moment there, just the whamness of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I was also impressed in how well you captured all of this. She has this ability to capture a character, not just with the very lengthy physical descriptions of earlier writers, but also to place that character in a context. For instance, with Vera Kirill, she was a full 40 years old, an early marriage, children, a strong secret passion, and Russia's demise had made of her what she had become. That's pretty packed.
That's pretty packed.
And is that also true?
That's totally Berberova. You know, her ability to take that, what's really important, and just give it to you all at once, and as a whole.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say that's a huge strength of hers. That you know so much about these people but you know them from odd things. You don't know them from, like, you know, where they went to high school.
You know them because they're pushing this cart down the road or something.
Yeah, or, you know, or Russia's demise.
Right.
I mean, how many people's character are bound up with the demise of an entire country?
And there's so much, unlike in the past, where we're very much in a present moment, just caught up in this present, and we are also caught in the fleetingness of the present moment as he is fleeing. Here, there is this very Slavic yearning and dwelling, and the mixture of the past in the present. It's not that the present is multidimensional, and Shai knew a lot about himself. You might even say that as a man of a certain generation, he knew almost everything about himself. Like many of them, he knew how to be his own shadow, to revive the past in a dream, to move with the present, to find in the cruelty of despair a sensuality accessible to many who, like him, had been thrown out of joint 15 years before, and all these years had burned, not lived, between ecstasies and curses. And again, there's this carrying of the past, and she is a chronicle of that situation, a chronicler of that situation.
And she did it in fiction and in nonfiction. I recently reread her autobiography, which I don't think many people read it from beginning to end. I don't know that I'd ever actually read it from beginning to, I'd read all of it, but not as a piece, and was completely bowled over by her obsession with what happened to everybody as a result of the revolution and the displacement. One thing that tickles me in that passage is this very Russian idea that they actually know the answers to things. They're convinced. I mean, this is a completely Russian trait. I don't know, probably other nationalities do this too, but Russians really think that there is a right answer. Like there's a definitive answer, whereas we're sort of, well, maybe it could be this and depending on the circumstances, but that's how they're trained to think and how they're taught, they're educated to think that they can know everything about themselves.
And it was from in this group and these anti-Bolsheviks group, the power of the Orthodox Church and that hypocrisy had only further amplified that characteristic. Just as the Bolshevik side, we're also we see this in the Civil War sharpens this.
Except these people are not Catholic. These people are not Russian Orthodox. These people are completely secular.
They're secular, but they're still they're still
Russian.
they're still in that same tradition. They went to these schools that were either military or they were, and then there's that they have fears, and they're afraid of grapes. Can you talk about they're afraid of grapes? There's so many different branches of agriculture here, but we Russians may be better suited to major crops. We're afraid of truffles, olives, and grapes. That's what people say about us, that we're afraid of grapes, and they laugh at us a little. People here raise special draft cows and eat cheese. They do all kinds of things. Right now, they're very interested in asparagus. And I think that this culinary collision is also something, that is an important thing for people.
Why aren't they planting potatoes?
Yeah.
I mean, for goodness sake. Actually, at one point, NEA decides to plant a portion of the land he's leased in wheat because there's something like a spiritual connection with it, that you have to have wheat. I don't think he ever plants potatoes. They probably do it in their home garden, in the vegetable, in their kitchen garden. But yeah, I mean, grapes. What would you do with grapes? You can do anything with potatoes, but what can you do with grapes?
But as comical as that passage is, it also pinpoints, I think, a major theme in the book, which is, are we staying here? Are we going to assimilate? Are we going to become grape eaters?
Well, that's the title. I mean, I didn't talk about the title, but these terms of being a last or a first. In fact, the title was the reason I never read the book until a few years ago, because I had no idea what it meant, what it was about. It was a very specific time limited phenomenon, and it was the people who left. Of course, nobody knew whether they would be able to go back. Now we know they couldn't, but then they didn't. And so, and there's a lot of talk about this in the book, about people who felt that they were lasts, people who were the last of a generation, who were just kind of living out their lives here and were never going to change. And then there were firsts who were going to start something new. The little bit of subtlety here is in Ya, who's this very successful and level-headed young man who, yes, the question is, if you're a first, does that mean you're not going back? Does that mean you're assimilating? So the question of assimilation is an undercurrent that comes into it. So I can't remember what your question was, but the last and the first.
But it is about assimilation, and it's about the conflict. Are we going to assimilate or not? And there's a little more going on in the background that historically, because I think at this time it was in the Soviet Union, it was probably the time of the new economic policy, so that the father who was ostensibly summoning these people has become has risen to some position. Well, because the party suddenly allowed capitalists, they allowed a measure of capitalism back into the economy. So you had all these wheeler-dealer types running, and so there's a kind of something smelly about those people.
I also wonder whether it's even true that the father
Yeah.
did get that position.
Yeah.
There's no confirmation of this. It's
And-
only hearsay that he did.
Right, and that-
And yeah, and that's why this whole idea of returnism came in, because of the new economic policy and then needing expertise that they thought the workers and peasants would be able to jumpstart the new economy, and then found that there was not the collective knowledge and history to be able to do that. Yeah.
but we have these devious machinations happening in the background, and agents of these devious machinations connected somehow to the Soviet authorities, perhaps even inventing this father figure, perhaps, but we sense it's at the same time Mayakovsky's writing, leaning away from, it's with
2
the
years from
Bedbug,
suicide.
yeah, exactly, and so we sense that this great experiment is already, these people already knew it.
And they all knew about arrests. They all knew that there were, that it wasn't safe to go back. They all knew about the political repressions that were going on. So, and there were already, and this continued well into the 30s about people being lured back, there being agents, there being, political machinations among the immigrant community.
And what would be so strong as lure them back? This very Russianness, that very identity, right?
Well, their identity, but also that there was no life for them in France. France didn't, they were all on these, they were stateless. They had these non-cent passports. So they were very limited in what they could do in France, especially if they weren't going to marry into the culture. So, yeah.
Well, just a couple more questions, if I may. There are a couple songs in the book, and can you elucidate the origins of these songs?
No, I looked them up, and they apparently do not exist in written form. So I did actually check that. Knowing who was going to ask me.
The thing is,
I
Miriam
don't know
plays
why.
guitar, and I wanted her to bring the guitar and sing them. But
They're not famous songs, and they're not. I'm sure they may have existed, but she may have made them up.
and when you translated them, did you think of a melody?
But I did think of rhythm.
Really?
Do they work like as lyric? That's something that I think is a big problem in a lot of Russian translations, maybe under the Nabokov influence, is that they translate verse not as verse, which is wrong.
Well, one other question, because I know we're running a little late on time, but there is a profound kind of philosophical component to this book. It's in the background sometimes. There's this wayfarer figure. There's a Tolstoyan element, and I'm wondering this rootedness to the land, or this connection to the land, to the earth, and is the earth transnational? And could you talk a little bit about that Tolstoyan?
Yeah, I actually did not cop to that originally. It was in Nabokov reviewed the book in 1931, and he talked about he pointed out this idea of a land, which doesn't appear anywhere else in Berberova. She was a city girl. She wasn't really interested in it. It's all very unusual. Well, to a certain extent, there are stories that take place outside of Paris, where she had a garden, but as far as land, that's not the same thing. Yeah, I think that there really are these Tolstoyan elements of that a Russian has a connection to the land, and that a Russian, in order to, not that all Russians think this, but there's a notion of a concept of the Russian soul being tied to the land. And I see Ilya, the son, is very much like a Levin character. Levin from Anna Karenina, who spends the whole novel trying to figure out the right way to live, and how one lives a good life and ends up coming to the land. And yeah, it doesn't take that long. Maybe he read Tolstoy, I don't know. But he goes to the land even though he's not from the land. He's a city kid, and he actually tries to rescue other very poor Russians in Paris by bringing them to the land.
Before they get captured by the other people who are luring them back.
Yeah, right. So I Berberova also revised the Constance Garnett translation of Anna Karenina. So she was, I mean, later, but I think there was more connection to Tolstoy than I've ever heard anyone say before. But having translated both books, I see it.
It was, I felt that
Yeah.
this in this kind of undercurrent. Anyway, it's a remarkable book, and it's a great just depiction of these people. We would not otherwise think about them, I think, if it weren't for this book and your translation.
Nobody, I mean, she talked about people who were completely overlooked by everybody else. But I also like, I mean, there's some incredible images, incredible poetic images. That image of the birds flying through the sky, looking like needles darting through the sky. That's a killer. That's a good one. And I love there's these wooden shoes keep coming up, and they're so telling. The last sentence of the this is at the very end. This is Anyuta, the little girl. Then she firmly turned the spigot with both hands and started back, pulled to one side by the weight, and holding her arm out exaggeratedly far, the way Mariana did. A few heavy drops fell on her dusty wooden shoe. I mean, there's poetry in this book.
Definitely.
There's a lot of poetry in this book.
Great. I think we're probably at time, but perhaps afterwards, if they had questions, we can shut the Zoom off, and if people have questions for us, we can answer them.
Sure. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you, Malvern.
Thank you, Malvern.